The humid Miami air hung thick and heavy on the evening of October 12, 1996, as Michael and Sarah Castellanos stepped out of their gleaming white Cadillac and into the marble lobby of the Fontainebleau Hotel. The newlyweds had been married just 3 days earlier in a small ceremony in Sarah's hometown of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and Miami was meant to be the start of their new life together. Michael, 29, had recently secured a promising position with a construction company in Tampa, while Sarah, 24, dreamed of opening her own boutique once they settled into married life. The October breeze carried the scent of ocean salt and blooming jasmine through the hotel's towering windows, and for a moment everything felt perfect. Before we continue with this incredible story, I'd love for you to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps us bring you more of these fascinating true stories. Michael carried their matching burgundy suitcases through the ornate lobby, his brown eyes scanning the elegant surroundings with the careful attention of someone who had spent years working construction sites. He had saved for months to afford this honeymoon, wanting to give Sarah something special before they started their practical life together in Tampa. Sarah walked beside him, her blonde hair catching the warm light from the crystal chandeliers, her fingers nervously adjusting the simple gold wedding band that still felt foreign on her hand. She had grown up on her family's farm in Iowa, and the luxury of the Fontainebleau felt both thrilling and overwhelming. "Room 847, the desk clerk announced with a professional smile, handing Michael the keycards. "The Ocean View Suite, as requested. Enjoy your stay, Mr. and Mrs. Castellanos." The name still made Sarah smile. She had only been Sarah Castellanos for 3 days, and each time she heard it, it felt like a small miracle. They had met 18 months earlier at a county fair in Cedar Rapids, where Michael had been visiting his aunt. He was immediately drawn to Sarah's quiet intelligence and genuine warmth, while she was captivated by his steady confidence and the way he listened to her dreams of running her own business without ever making them seem impossible. The elevator carried them to the 8th floor in comfortable silence, both lost in the surreal feeling that they were finally here, finally married, finally beginning the life they had planned together through countless late-night phone calls and weekend visits over the past year and a half. Their room overlooked the Atlantic Ocean, and Sarah pressed her face to the window, watching the moonlight dance on the waves. "We made it," she whispered, and Michael wrapped his arms around her from behind, breathing in the familiar scent of her lavender shampoo. They spent their first evening exploring the hotel's restaurants and bars, Michael nursing a single beer while Sarah sipped a frozen margarita that made her giggle with its strength. They talked about their plans for Tampa, about the small house Michael had found for them to rent, about Sarah's ideas for her boutique. "I want to focus on clothes for working women," she explained, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. "Practical but beautiful things, pieces that make you feel confident." Michael loved watching her talk about her dreams. It reminded him why he had fallen in love with her in the first place. The next morning, October 13th, they woke early and walked along Miami Beach, collecting shells and taking photographs with Sarah's new Polaroid camera. Michael had surprised her with it as a wedding gift, knowing how much she loved capturing moments. She took pictures of everything: the sunrise over the ocean, Michael's hands as he held a conch shell to his ear, their bare feet in the sand, the seagulls diving for scraps near the pier. "I want to remember everything," she told him, and Michael promised they would return to Miami for their 10th anniversary. They spent the afternoon by the hotel pool, Sarah reading a romance novel while Michael dozed in the sun. Occasionally, she would read him amusing passages, and they would laugh together, the sound mixing with the splash of other guests and the distant hum of Ocean Drive traffic. At sunset, they dressed for dinner at the hotel's finest restaurant, where Michael had made reservations weeks in advance. Sarah wore a navy blue dress she had bought specially for the honeymoon, and Michael wore his only suit, the same one he had married her in. They held hands across the white tablecloth, talking quietly about their future while the ocean sparkled beyond the restaurant's floor-to-ceiling windows. The trouble began on their second full day in Miami, October 14th, when Michael received an unexpected phone call in their room. Sarah was in the shower, humming softly as she shampooed her hair, when she heard Michael's voice through the bathroom door, tense and clipped in a way she had never heard before. "I told you, I don't know anything about that," he was saying. "You must have the wrong person." When she emerged from the bathroom wrapped in the hotel's plush robe, Michael was standing by the window, his jaw tight with worry. "Who was that?" Sarah asked, toweling her hair dry. Michael hesitated for a moment before answering. "Wrong number," he said, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. Sarah knew him well enough to recognize when he was troubled, but she also knew better than to push when he wasn't ready to talk. She had learned during their courtship that Michael sometimes carried burdens silently, a trait she attributed to growing up as the eldest son in a Mexican-American family in El Paso, Texas, where he had learned early to shoulder responsibility without complaint. They spent the morning at the Vizcaya Museum and Gardens, wandering through the elaborate Italian Renaissance-style villa and its formal gardens. Sarah took dozens of Polaroid pictures, but Michael seemed distracted, checking his watch frequently and glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone to follow them. "Are you feeling all right?" Sarah finally asked as they sat on a marble bench overlooking Biscayne Bay. The October sun was warm on their faces, and the gardens were filled with the sound of peacocks and the gentle splash of fountains. "Just thinking about the move to Tampa," Michael replied. But Sarah could see the lie in his eyes. She had never known him to be deceptive, and it worried her more than she wanted to admit. They had built their relationship on honesty and trust, spending hours on the phone during their long-distance courtship, talking about everything from their childhood fears to their dreams for the future. This sudden distance between them felt like a cold shadow falling across their happiness. That afternoon, while they lounged by the pool, Sarah noticed a man in a dark suit watching them from the hotel's tiki bar. He wasn't dressed for the beach, and his intense stare made her uncomfortable. When she pointed him out to Michael, her new husband's face went pale. "Let's go back to the room," he said abruptly, gathering their towels and Sarah's book. "I think I've had too much sun." But as they walked through the hotel lobby, Sarah caught a glimpse of Michael glancing back toward the bar, his expression filled with something that looked dangerously close to fear. In their room, Michael paced while Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, watching him with growing concern. The ocean breeze stirred the curtains, and somewhere below them she could hear the sounds of other hotel guests enjoying their vacations. Laughter from the pool, the distant music from a steel drum band, the gentle crash of waves against the shore. It all felt surreal against the tension that had suddenly filled their beautiful room. "Michael, please tell me what's wrong," she said softly. "We promised to be honest with each other, remember?" Michael stopped pacing and sat beside her on the bed, taking her hands in his. They were rough from years of construction work, but they had always made her feel safe. Now, however, she could feel them trembling slightly. "There are some things about my past that I never told you," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "Things I'm not proud of. I thought they were behind me, but—" He trailed off, unable to meet her eyes. "I never meant for any of this to touch you, Sarah." "You have to believe that." The phone rang again, shrill and demanding in the sudden silence. Michael looked at it as if it were a snake coiled to strike, and for a long moment neither of them moved. Finally, Sarah reached for it, but Michael caught her wrist. "Don't!" he said urgently. "Please, just let it ring." They sat frozen as the phone continued its insistent demand for attention. 7 rings, 8, 9, before finally falling silent. In the quiet that followed, Sarah could hear her own heartbeat and the sound of Michael's ragged breathing. Whatever was happening, she realized, their honeymoon was over. That evening, Michael finally told Sarah the truth that would shatter their perfect new world. They sat on their room's small balcony, overlooking the ocean, the warm October breeze carrying the sounds of South Beach's nightlife up to their 8th-floor perch. Sarah had ordered room service, grilled snapper and plantains from the hotel's Caribbean menu, but neither of them had touched their food. The plate sat cooling between them as Michael struggled to find the words that would explain the phone calls, the man at the tiki bar, and the fear that had been growing in his chest since they arrived in Miami. "Before I met you," Michael began, his voice barely audible over the sound of the waves, "I was involved with some people in El Paso. Bad people. I was young and stupid, and I needed money fast." He paused, staring out at the dark water where distant cruise ships sparkled like floating cities. "My father had gotten sick, cancer, and the medical bills were crushing my family. I started doing some work for a man named Carlos Mendoza, nothing violent, just driving packages from one place to another, picking up payments. I told myself I was helping my family, but I knew what I was really doing." Sarah felt her stomach drop. This wasn't the Michael she knew, the steady, honest man who had courted her with such patience and respect. "What kind of packages?" she asked, though part of her didn't want to know the answer. Michael finally looked at her, and she could see the shame and regret written across his features. "Drugs," he said simply. "Cocaine, mostly. I was a courier for about 8 months until my father died, and I realized what I had become. I took the money I had saved and moved to Iowa to be near my aunt. I thought I had left it all behind." The revelation hung between them like a physical presence. Sarah tried to process what her husband was telling her, this man she had married just 4 days ago, this man she thought she knew completely. "The phone calls," she said slowly. "They're from these people?" Michael nodded, his hands gripping the balcony railing so tightly his knuckles were white. "Carlos wants me back. He says there's a job, a big one, and he needs someone he can trust, someone who knows how to keep quiet." He turned to face her fully, desperation in his dark eyes. "Sarah, I swear to you I told him no. I told him I was married now, that I had a different life, but he's not the kind of man who accepts no for an answer." Sarah stood up abruptly, walking to the far edge of the balcony where the ocean stretched endlessly toward the horizon. She had grown up in a world where problems were solved with hard work and honesty, where the worst troubles were crop failures and county fair politics. This was something far beyond her experience. "What does he want you to do?" she asked without turning around. Michael's voice, when he answered, was thick with self-loathing. "There's a shipment coming into Miami next week. He wants me to pick it up and drive it to Atlanta. Says it's worth more money than I made in my whole 8 months working for him. Enough to set us up for life. And if you refuse?" Sarah already knew the answer, but she needed to hear it said aloud. Michael was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "Carlos doesn't make threats, Sarah. He makes promises. If I don't do this job, he'll make sure I can't run far enough to escape him, and now that he knows about you—" He couldn't finish the sentence, but Sarah understood. They had found him, and by extension they had found her. Their perfect new life in Tampa, their dreams of Sarah's boutique and Michael's construction career, all of it was suddenly as fragile as soap bubbles. Sarah turned back to face her husband, this stranger she had married, this man whose past had followed them to their honeymoon paradise. The lights of Miami sparkled below them, beautiful and dangerous, full of secrets and possibilities. "What are we going to do?" she asked, though part of her already knew that the "we" in that question might be the problem. Michael stood and tried to reach for her, but she stepped back, needing space to think. "I don't know," he admitted. I've been trying to figure that out since the first phone call. Maybe we can go to the police, or maybe we can just run. Change our names, start over somewhere. Carlos will never find us. But even as he said it, they both knew how naive that sounded. People like Carlos Mendoza had long reaches and patient memories. The phone in their room began ringing again, its shrill demand cutting through the warm night air like a blade. This time, neither of them moved to answer it. They stood on their balcony, 8 floors above the city that had transformed from honeymoon paradise to potential trap, listening to the phone ring and wondering if their marriage would survive its first week. The morning of October 15th dawned grey and humid, with threatening clouds rolling in from the Atlantic that perfectly matched the mood in room 847. Sarah had barely slept, lying awake listening to Michael's restless tossing and the occasional sound of voices in the hallway. Every footstep, every elevator ding, every closing door made her wonder if Carlos Mendoza's people had finally come to collect her husband. She watched the sunrise through their ocean view window, painting the clouds in shades of pink and gold, and tried to remember what it felt like to be happy just 2 days ago. Michael was already awake when she turned from the window, sitting on the edge of the bed with his head in his hands. He had showered and dressed in the khaki pants and polo shirt they had bought together for the honeymoon, but he looked like a man preparing for his own execution. The phone stopped ringing around 3 a.m., he said without looking up. I counted. 47 calls. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. The persistence was terrifying in its implications. Whoever was calling wasn't going to simply give up and move on. They went down to the hotel's breakfast buffet, though neither had much appetite. Sarah picked at a croissant and fresh fruit, while Michael nursed a cup of coffee, both of them scanning the dining room for signs of surveillance. The normalcy of the other guests, families with children arguing over cereal choices, elderly couples reading newspapers, business travelers checking their phones, felt like a scene from another world. Sarah found herself memorizing details, the laugh of a little girl at the next table, the way the morning light streamed through the restaurant's windows, the smell of bacon and fresh orange juice. If these were to be among her last normal moments, she wanted to remember them. I've made a decision, Michael said suddenly, his voice low but determined. I'm going to meet with Carlos. Today. I'm going to tell him face to face that I won't do the job, and that if he bothers us again, I'll go to the FBI. Sarah nearly choked on her orange juice. Michael, no, you said yourself he's dangerous. What if... But Michael was already shaking his head. What if he never stops calling? What if he follows us to Tampa or shows up at your boutique someday? I can't live looking over my shoulder for the rest of my life, and I won't ask you to live that way either. Sarah reached across the table and took his hand, her wedding ring catching the morning light. Then we'll face this together. I'm not letting you go alone. But Michael pulled his hand away gently, his eyes filled with a sadness that made him look far older than his 29 years. This is my mess, Sarah, my past. You didn't sign up for this when you married me. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. They had literally signed up for better or worse just 4 days earlier, but neither had imagined that the worse would arrive quite so quickly. They returned to their room to find a note that had been slipped under their door. Sarah's hands shook as she read it. Room 1247, 2 o'clock, come alone. The paper was hotel stationery, but the handwriting was unfamiliar, sharp, angular letters that seemed to slice across the page. Michael took the note from her and studied it, his jaw set in grim determination. This is it, he said. This ends today. But Sarah could see the fear behind his brave words, and she wondered if her husband truly understood what he was walking into. The hours until 2 o'clock crawled by with agonizing slowness. They tried to act normal, walking through the hotel's shops, sitting by the pool, even taking more photographs with Sarah's Polaroid camera. But every image came out slightly blurred, as if the camera could sense the tension in their hands. Sarah took one final picture of Michael sitting on their balcony, looking out at the ocean with the Miami skyline in the background. Later, she would treasure this photograph more than any other because it captured the last moment when she still believed everything would work out, when she still thought love and determination could overcome the shadows of the past. At 1:45 p.m., Michael kissed Sarah goodbye. It was supposed to be a quick meeting, just long enough for him to make his position clear and establish the boundaries that would allow them to start their life together in peace. "I'll be back in an hour," he promised, straightening the collar of his polo shirt and checking his watch. "Pack our things. As soon as I'm done with this, we're leaving Miami." Sarah nodded, though something deep in her chest felt like a stone had settled there. She watched from their balcony as Michael crossed the hotel's pool deck and disappeared into the building, heading for the elevators that would carry him to room 1247 and whatever waited for him there. An hour passed. Then 2. By 4 o'clock, Sarah was pacing their room like a caged animal, checking her watch every few minutes and jumping at every sound in the hallway. She called the front desk to ask if there were any messages, but there were none. She considered going to room 1247 herself, but Michael had made her promise to stay in their room no matter what happened. As the afternoon stretched into evening and the sun began to set over Biscayne Bay, Sarah finally accepted what her heart had been trying to tell her all along. Michael wasn't coming back. Sarah's world collapsed in slow motion over the next 24 hours. She spent the night of October 15th sitting by the phone, willing it to ring with Michael's voice, explaining where he was, why he had been delayed, when he would return to their room. She called the hotel operator every hour, asking if there were any messages, any calls, any sign that her husband of 5 days still existed somewhere in the building. The night desk clerk, a kindly Cuban woman named Rosa, eventually came to check on her personally, bringing tea and gentle assurances that were meant to be comforting, but only served to highlight how alone Sarah had become. By morning, Sarah could no longer pretend that Michael might simply be delayed. She called the Miami-Dade Police Department, her voice shaking as she tried to explain to the desk sergeant that her husband had gone to meet someone in the hotel and never returned. "How long has he been missing, ma'am?" the officer asked, and when Sarah answered 14 hours, she could practically hear him rolling his eyes. "Adults have a right to go where they please," he explained patiently. "We can't file a missing person report until he's been gone for 24 hours. And even then, if there's no evidence of foul play." Sarah hung up and sat on the bed she had shared with Michael, staring at his suitcase, which still lay open with his clothes neatly folded inside. His reading glasses sat on the nightstand next to a paperback Tom Clancy novel he had been working through. His cologne, the same woody scent he had worn on their first date, still lingered on his pillow. Everything in the room spoke of a man who had intended to return, who had expected to wake up beside his wife and continue their honeymoon as planned. The disconnect between these intimate reminders and Michael's absence felt surreal, as if reality had somehow come unstuck. At noon, Sarah mustered the courage to go to room 1247. Her hands trembled as she knocked on the door, and when no one answered, she knocked harder, calling Michael's name. A housekeeping attendant, a young Haitian woman who spoke broken English, told Sarah that the room had been empty when she cleaned it that morning. "No person inside," she said, shaking her head sympathetically. "Very clean, like nobody stay." Sarah convinced the woman to let her look inside, though it violated hotel policy. The room was identical to her own, but completely sterile. No luggage, no personal items, no indication that anyone had been there at all. That evening, Sarah finally called Michael's Aunt Eleanor in Cedar Rapids, the woman who had introduced them at the county fair 18 months earlier. Eleanor's voice was warm and concerned as she listened to Sarah's story, but she had no insight to offer. "Michael never mentioned anyone named Carlos," she said. "But then he never talked much about his time in El Paso. I always wondered what drove him to leave Texas so suddenly." The conversation left Sarah feeling more isolated than before. If Michael's own aunt didn't know about his past, then perhaps Sarah had never really known her husband at all. The next day, October 17th, the police finally agreed to take Sarah's missing person report. Detective Ray Martinez was a soft-spoken man in his 50s who had spent most of his career dealing with Miami's tourist-related crimes. He listened to Sarah's story with professional attention, taking notes in a small leather notebook and asking careful questions about Michael's background. When Sarah mentioned Carlos Mendoza and Michael's admission about drug running in El Paso, Detective Martinez's expression grew more serious. "Mrs. Castellanos," he said gently, "I need you to understand that if your husband was involved with drug dealers, this situation could be very dangerous. These aren't people who negotiate or compromise." Sarah spent 3 more days at the Fontainebleau, hoping against hope that Michael would return, that there would be some explanation that would restore their life together. She barely ate, surviving on room service tea and the occasional piece of toast. She took long walks on the beach where they had collected shells just days earlier, looking for any sign of her husband, any clue that might explain what had happened to him. Hotel guests and staff began to recognize her. The young woman in the sundress who wandered the property with haunted eyes, asking everyone she met if they had seen her missing husband. On October 20th, exactly 1 week after Michael's disappearance, Detective Martinez came to the hotel to deliver news that would haunt Sarah for the next 9 years. "We found a body in Biscayne Bay this morning," he said, his voice gentle but professional. "Male, approximately 30 years old, Hispanic. He'd been in the water for several days." Sarah felt the world tilt around her, but the detective continued. "The body showed signs of trauma consistent with violence, but the face was too damaged by marine life for visual identification. We'll need dental records to confirm identity." Sarah called Michael's dentist in El Paso, her hands shaking as she explained the situation to the receptionist. The dental records would take several days to obtain and compare, leaving Sarah in a horrible limbo between hope and despair. She extended her stay at the hotel, unable to leave Miami, while there was still a chance, however slim, that the body wasn't Michael's, that her husband might still be alive somewhere. But deep in her heart, in the place where wives know things about their husbands, Sarah already knew that her honeymoon had become her husband's grave, and that her marriage, which had lasted only 1 week, was over before it had truly begun. The dental records confirmed what Sarah's heart had already accepted. The body pulled from Biscayne Bay was indeed Michael Castellanos. The news reached her on October 25th, 13 days after Michael had disappeared, and exactly 2 weeks since they had arrived in Miami as excited newlyweds. Detective Martinez delivered the confirmation in person, sitting across from Sarah in the hotel's quiet lobby bar, while the sounds of normal vacation life, laughter from the pool, the clink of glasses, conversations in multiple languages, created a surreal soundtrack to the end of her world. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Castellanos," Detective Martinez said, his weathered hands folded on the small table between them. "The medical examiner confirmed the identity this morning. Your husband had been shot twice in the chest at close range. Based on the condition of the body and the water temperature, we estimate he died within hours of when you last saw him on October 15th. Sarah stared at her hands, at the wedding ring that now felt like a monument to something that had barely existed, and tried to process the reality that Michael had been dead for 10 days while she waited for him to return. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of the tragedy that had engulfed their marriage. Carlos Mendoza was indeed a significant figure in the El Paso drug trade, with connections reaching from the Mexican border to cities throughout the American South. According to Detective Martinez, Mendoza's operation had been under FBI surveillance for months, and Michael's name had appeared in several intercepted phone conversations. "Your husband wasn't lying when he said he'd tried to leave that world behind," the detective explained, "but people like Mendoza don't believe in retirement. When they need someone, they expect that person to answer the call." The FBI agents who eventually interviewed Sarah, Special Agent Patricia Chen and Special Agent David Rodriguez, painted an even grimmer picture. Mendoza's organization had been planning to move a major shipment of cocaine through Miami in late October, using the city's busy tourist traffic as cover. Michael's familiarity with cross-country driving routes and his clean record since leaving El Paso had made him an ideal candidate for the job. "When your husband refused to participate," Agent Chen explained, "Mendoza saw it as both a business problem and a personal insult. In his world, that kind of defiance carries a death sentence." Sarah learned that the meeting in room 1247 had been a setup from the beginning. Hotel security cameras had captured Michael entering the elevator at 1:52 p.m. on October 15th, but the cameras on the 12th floor had mysteriously malfunctioned that afternoon. Two men in business suits had been seen leaving the hotel through a service entrance around 3:30 p.m., but their faces weren't clearly visible on the footage. The room had been registered under a false name with a stolen credit card, and despite the FBI's best efforts, Carlos Mendoza himself had vanished, likely back across the border into Mexico, where American law enforcement couldn't reach him. The cruelest irony was that Michael's death had been completely unnecessary. 2 days after his murder, the FBI had raided Mendoza's El Paso operation, arresting 17 people and seizing over $2 million worth of cocaine and cash. The Miami shipment Michael had been intended to transport was intercepted at the port of Miami, and several key members of Mendoza's organization were now facing federal drug trafficking charges. If Michael had simply waited another week, if he had gone to the FBI instead of trying to handle the situation himself, he might have lived to see his tormentors brought to justice. Sarah made the devastating phone calls to her family in Cedar Rapids and to Michael's relatives in El Paso, trying to explain not only that her husband of 1 week was dead, but that he had been murdered because of a past she had never known existed. Her parents, Robert and Margaret Patterson, drove down from Iowa to help her make the arrangements, their faces etched with grief and confusion. They had liked Michael immediately when Sarah brought him home for Christmas the previous year, impressed by his respectful manner and obvious devotion to their daughter. Now they struggled to reconcile that memory with the revelation of his criminal past. Michael's funeral was held on November 2nd at St. Mary's Catholic Church in Cedar Rapids, where Sarah had been baptized as a child. The service was small. Sarah's family, a few friends, and Michael's Aunt Eleanor, who had driven up from Iowa City. None of Michael's relatives from El Paso attended, whether from fear of association with his death or simple geographic distance. Sarah never learned. She stood at the graveside in Oak Hill Cemetery, wearing the black dress she had bought for job interviews, watching her husband's casket being lowered into Iowa soil, and wondered how a marriage that had lasted only 7 days could leave such an enormous void in her life. In the weeks that followed, Sarah discovered that grief was not a linear process, but a chaotic spiral of emotions that struck without warning. She would find herself crying in grocery stores when she saw the brand of cereal Michael preferred, or waking in the middle of the night, reaching for him across an empty bed. The Tampa house they had planned to rent remained empty. The security deposit eventually returned to Sarah, along with Michael's final paycheck from the construction company. The dreams she had shared with her husband her boutique, their quiet life together, their planned return to Miami for their 10th anniversary, all became painful reminders of a future that would never arrive. 9 years after Michael's death, in the spring of 2005, Sarah was working as a high school English teacher in Dubuque, Iowa, when she received a phone call that would resurrect the ghosts of her brief marriage. She had rebuilt her life slowly and carefully, eventually earning her teaching degree and finding purpose in helping teenagers navigate literature and writing. She had never remarried, though she had dated occasionally. The shadow of Michael's death and the circumstances surrounding it had made trust difficult. She lived in a small craftsman house near the school where she taught, with a garden where she grew the same varieties of tomatoes her father had cultivated on the family farm. The call came on a Thursday afternoon in April, just as Sarah was grading essays about The Great Gatsby, a book that never failed to remind her of dreams deferred and the dangerous allure of reinvention. Mrs. Castellanos. The voice was unfamiliar, professionally courteous, but carrying an undertone of excitement. "This is Detective Lisa Warren with the Miami-Dade Police Department. I'm calling about your husband's case. We may have found something important." Sarah's hands began to shake as Detective Warren explained. During the renovation of the Fontainebleau Hotel's 12th floor, construction workers had discovered a hidden compartment behind the bathroom wall in room 1247, the same room where Michael had gone to meet Carlos Mendoza's representatives. Inside the compartment, wrapped in plastic to protect it from moisture, they had found a small leather journal that appeared to have been deliberately hidden. "The hotel's records show that room was sealed and unused for several months after your husband's death," Detective Warren continued. "It's possible this journal was placed there by someone who wanted it found eventually, but not immediately." The journal, Detective Warren explained, contained detailed entries written in Spanish and English, documenting drug shipments, payment schedules, and operational details of what appeared to be a major trafficking network. More importantly for Sarah, the final entries were dated in October 1996 and mentioned Michael by name. "Mrs. Castellanos, I think your husband may have been gathering evidence," the detective said. "The entries suggest he was planning to go to the FBI, but he needed more information to ensure his testimony would be meaningful. This journal might be what got him killed, and it might also be what finally brings his killers to justice." Sarah felt the careful stability of her life in Dubuque suddenly shift beneath her feet. For 9 years, she had worked to accept Michael's death as a senseless tragedy, the result of his youthful mistakes, catching up with him at the worst possible moment. The idea that he might have been actively working to redeem himself, that his death might have been the result of heroism rather than simply bad timing, was both comforting and devastating. It suggested that the Michael she had fallen in love with, honest, determined, protective, had been real, but it also meant his murder had prevented him from completing what might have been an act of genuine courage. Detective Warren invited Sarah to Miami to examine the journal and discuss its implications for the case. "The statute of limitations hasn't run out on your husband's murder," she explained. "And this new evidence might give us leads we never had before. Some of the people mentioned in these entries are still active, still involved in trafficking. Your husband's death might help us save other lives." Sarah found herself agreeing to make the trip, despite the emotional cost of returning to the city where her marriage had ended in tragedy. The flight to Miami in May 2005 felt like traveling backward through time. Sarah, now 33 and marked by the quiet strength that comes from surviving profound loss, looked down at the familiar coastline and skyline and felt the old grief rising in her chest like a tide. The Fontainebleau Hotel had been renovated since her last visit, its Art Deco facade restored and modernized, but the sight of it still took her breath away. Detective Warren met her at the airport, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner that reminded Sarah of her favorite high school teachers. The journal itself was smaller than Sarah had expected, a black leather notebook about the size of a paperback book, with pages covered in Michael's familiar handwriting. Seeing his careful script again after 9 years was like hearing his voice from beyond the grave. The early entries were mundane, recording his daily activities in the weeks leading up to their wedding, but as the pages progressed, they revealed Michael's growing awareness that his past was about to resurface, and his desperate attempts to gather enough information about Carlos Mendoza's operation to make himself valuable to law enforcement. He was smart about it, Detective Warren said, pointing to specific entries. Look here. He's not just recording what Mendoza told him, but also trying to verify the information through other sources. He was building a case, Mrs. Castellanos, a real case that could have taken down the entire network. The final entry, dated October 14, 1996, the day before Michael's death, was the most heartbreaking of all. I love Sarah more than my own life, he had written. If something happens to me, I hope she knows I was trying to be worthy of her faith in me. The meeting tomorrow will either free us both or destroy everything, but I can't let these people threaten the woman I love. She deserves better than to live in fear because of my mistakes. Sarah read those words sitting in the Miami police station, surrounded by the efficient bustle of detectives and clerks, with the Florida sun streaming through high windows and the distant sound of traffic from the streets where she and Michael had walked as newlyweds 9 years earlier. She understood finally that her husband's death had not been the result of his inability to escape his past, but rather his determination to confront it head-on. He had died trying to protect her, trying to ensure that their future together would be free from the shadows that had followed him from El Paso to Iowa to Miami. The journal led to 17 new arrests over the following year, including several high-ranking members of Mendoza's organization who had evaded justice for nearly a decade. Carlos Mendoza himself remained beyond reach, reportedly living under cartel protection in Sinaloa, but his American network was finally dismantled. Detective Warren called Sarah regularly with updates, treating her not just as a victim's widow, but as a partner in seeing justice done. Your husband's courage is still saving lives, she told Sarah after the final arrests were made. The information in that journal has prevented shipments worth millions of dollars from reaching American streets. He would be proud of what his sacrifice accomplished. Sarah returned to her quiet life in Dubuque, but something fundamental had changed in her understanding of her brief marriage and tragic loss. The anger and confusion that had shadowed her for 9 years were replaced by a profound sadness mixed with unexpected pride. Michael had not been a perfect man, but he had been a brave one, and his love for her had motivated him to attempt something genuinely heroic. She began to speak about him differently, not as the victim of his own poor choices, but as a man who had died trying to do the right thing for the woman he loved. On October 15, 2006, exactly 10 years after Michael's death, Sarah made a pilgrimage to Miami Beach. She walked the same stretch of sand where they had collected shells and taken photographs during their brief honeymoon, and she scattered some of the wildflower seeds from her Iowa garden into the Atlantic waves. It wasn't the 10th anniversary celebration Michael had promised her, but it was a kind of completion, a way of honoring both their love and his sacrifice. As she watched the seeds disappear into the endless blue water, Sarah finally felt ready to let her husband rest in peace and to begin imagining a future that honored his memory without being imprisoned by it.